Where is your waist? What does it mean to bend at your waist? This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're talking about what does it actually mean to bend at your waist? And why is that something that in many cases we might want to avoid doing? So first we need to all get on the same page with what does this word mean? What is the waist? So socially, at least in the US, we talk about the waist as kind of an area. Depending on the person, that area might have different heights to it and different sizes. So Stan here is actually about the same height as me. He's just raised up a little bit. If I stick my heels at about the same height as his heels, we're actually about the same height. So our proportions could be fairly similar, except Stan here has a very long torso. If you look at the space between his lowest ribs and his pelvis, that's a lot of room. My lowest ribs are here. My pelvis is here. Got about an inch. That's it. So my waist takes up a different amount of space of my body than Stan's does. So it's not quite accurate to say that your waist is just like at a certain point, because that's going to kind of vary for different people. The way I talk about it is your waist is the space between your ribs and your pelvis. Why is it that we tend to bend here a whole lot? Well, it just doesn't have other ribs or pelvis, other bones attached to it. So if you kind of play around a little bit, if you're seated at the moment as you're watching this, kind of play around with what does it mean to bend from between your ribs and your pelvis. If you're standing, you might have really a lot of ability to kind of play around with this and mess with what does it mean to bend here. So structurally, what bones are there? Something's got to bend, right? What is it that's bending? Well, the only thing left in between the ribs and the pelvis is spine. Bending at your waist is bending your back. Simply by definition, it bends your spine, which we definitely socially tend to say as it's your back. So, a couple different interesting thought experiments here, movement experiments. What does it mean to bend at your waist to go forward, to lean forward? I would be shortening the distance between my rib cage and my pelvis in the front by crunching here. And it's interesting to use the word crunch for that because that's also an exercise, right? If you're laying on the floor and you're doing crunches, you are shortening the distance between your ribs and your pelvis by doing this, right? And that works those muscles. That's the purpose of that exercise. What happens if we bend backwards at the waist? We can consider that arching our backs. If we do that mostly with the top, we're going to end up looking way up. If we bend at the waist mostly with the bottom half of the torso, that's going to be arching that way and kind of sticking your tailbone and your butt out a little bit. That's also bending your spine. So, what are ways that we work with this within Alexander Technique? Because it's not that movement is bad. We're not going to sit here and tell people you should never bend at your waist. It's just a movement. This is flexible. We want our spines to be flexible, of course. You're not a statue. You're not made of rock. I want you to be able to move. And it turns out that bending a whole lot at this level, simply because there's no other wide bones there, is pretty inefficient compared to bending at an actual ball and socket joint, which is lower than that, and that's your hip joints. So if you haven't watched my video on hip joints and movement with that, I will link it down below, as well as put up a little link up above. This, which on me is right in there. So that's kind of my cross section there. If these two fingers were to meet in the center, that would be roughly my hip joint. That's actually where this leg pivots. Now, if we look at bending in the waist in order to do something like reach down. So if my goal here happens to be touch Stan's knee, or for example, that might be like pick up something that's on a low shelf, right? But here it's going to be touch Stan's knee. And if I do that by keeping my knees back, not really bending much in my hip joints, and instead bending from higher up at my waist, here's what that might look like. I could not breathe while I was doing that. It really tightened my torso. It's very hard to be able to breathe when you're bending at the waist. So, as a teacher who works mainly with musicians, at least on the university side of things, I work with students on this a lot, to not bend in their waists unnecessarily. Again, it's not that the movement is bad, it's just going to cause some side effects as far as what does it do to your breath, and how long are you going to be able to maintain that versus something like bending at the hip joints, along with ease and flexibility and range of motion at the knees and the ankles. To touch Stan's knee might look something more like this. I can breathe very easily. I've still got my breath support for my voice production here. If I were playing an instrument, of any instrument we might like to look at that uses the breath, this would still work. You can still totally play here. Works fine. Done it many times. And it allows me to use my actual ball and socket joints. It's kind of cool to look at this from an evolutionary biology point of view. What happened when we were more this way in terms of the orientation of the torso, right, to being more of a four-footed creature? There's a sharper angle between my torso and my legs compared to being upright in a fully bipedal, two-legged creature. This has to really extend out. And our structures in our low belly, in our legs, the pelvis, all of that is pretty unique among animals. There aren't a lot of other animals who are completely bipedal in the same way that we are. Certainly there are plenty who can walk on two legs, but it's not really where their structures want to be a lot of the time. So, one thing to get curious about, when are you bending at your waist and why? And if you find yourself doing something like this, can you come back up out of it in a way that's connected, in a way that balances, not going too far, back the other way? Because then that's just tightening on the other side. It's kind of interesting to look at, what do we associate socially, culturally with this? Well, I look like I should have a walker in front of me, right? This ages me about 50 years. When a lot of older folks get stuck into these patterns, we tend to associate that with, this is just what happens when you're old. It's just not true. It doesn't have to be that way. Certainly there are plenty of things that can make you end up there, but it's not solely a requirement of aging. A lot of that comes from, what have you been doing for 60, 70, 80 years? And if you get to that point, can we still ask for up? Knowing that you might not be able to get your spine to completely unbend out of that again, and that's okay. We're not looking for perfection. 10% improvement is still improvement. It still counts, it still matters, it's worth doing. And it can still create a lot more ease than asking these vertebrae in your spine to constantly be bent and have pressure on the front and an overstretch at the back. Because that's what's actually involved in bending at your waist. I tend to think of it as the old Barbie dolls who had like an actual ball and socket joint between like the ribs unit and the pelvis unit. That does not exist in an actual person. We don't actually have that. I think it can accidentally lead to some kind of mismappings on like, how do I work? Am I not actually structured like a doll? I'm actually structured like this thing, where I have this flexible tower in the center. And of course I want that to be able to move and do all sorts of different things. And I also know where my neutral is. I can come back to my neutral. I can allow my 4 natural curves to my spine to be there. So Stan here has a bolt through his neck, but the neck would go this way. This part of the spine goes this way, this part goes that way, and then the sacrum and the tailbone down here go this way. Watch what happens if I try to straighten my back. Okay, this part would have to go that way, this part would have to go this way, this would go that way, and this would have to go that way. That looks sustainable to you? Watch the top of my head. What happens to my height when I let go of this? Significantly taller, way easier to breathe, and not compressing myself. So those are all components to what does it mean to have freedom in my core, to let go of bending in my waist, to allow all of these structures to take up space, to move. In the future, we're going to be looking a good bit into breath anatomy and how that all works. And it's interesting to compare that, those anatomical ideas, the functioning of that with what does it mean to bend here? And why is it that if I'm standing in line for a while and I do this, why is my back going to hurt after a while? Well, let's look at it. What's actually bending? To be able to take this way. Well, I can't actually bend my pelvis, so it's above that. This is actually bending the waist sideways. It's bending in your back. If you stand in line for a while and you're dropped down, sticking one hip out, your core structure has been asked to bend in a place it does not want to. Coming back up out of that, letting both feet be on the floor, letting your knees be soft, allowing that ease, soft nestled connection between your head and your neck, being allowed to take up space sideways, is going to help a lot with the amount of chronic stress and fatigue and pain that can come up with going here all the time. So what I encourage you to look at this week is getting curious about when are you bending in your waist and why? And can you start to come back to neutral instead?